There is a certain image we hold of medieval kings. It's a familiar picture, etched in countless tailies and illustrations. A majestic figure, seated upon a throne of carved oak and gold, robes cascading down marble steps, a jeweled crown resting lightly upon his brow. In this vision, the king rules through sheer will, issuing proclamations with a commanding voice, deciding the fate of his kingdom with grand gestures and heroic certainty. Yet, this image, for all its brilliance, is a mirage, a shimmering reflection that hides a much quieter, heavier truth. For in reality, the life of a medieval king was not one of constant glory, nor of endless triumphs played out beneath fluttering banners. It was a life of ceaseless work, a position weighed down by the unrelenting gravity of governance. Kingship, in its most honest form, was not a stage for dramatic acts of power, but a chair at a long, narrow table, covered in scrolls, every morning, before the world beyond the stone walls had fully stirred. Before the town criers had raised their voices or the cathedral bells had begun their toll, the king's day would begin. Not with celebration, but with a door. A heavy, unassuming door, its wooden surface worn smooth by the brush of countless fingertips, its iron hinges creaking softly in the hush of dawn. That door, in its slow, deliberate swing open, marked the start of yet another day beneath. The crown. It was not the clang of swords or the roar of crowds that awaited the king beyond it, but rather a quiet hall, cool and dim, filled with waiting parchment, and people who had been waiting longer still. The throne room itself was not always the grand spectacle one might imagine. In the early hours, it was a chamber of stone and shadow, where torches flickered hesitantly against high walls, and tapestries hung like mute witnesses to the day's proceedings. The air was cool, not biting, but persistent, a cold that settled into the bones and made even kings wish for another hour beneath thick woolen blankets. But there was no indulgence in a ruler's morning. The work was already gathered, neatly arranged by stewards and clerks. Each scroll a quiet reminder of the kingdom's insatiable appetite for attention. First would come the petitions. It was a ritual as old as the monarchy itself, and yet it never grew any shorter. Nobles, merchants, abbots, and humble subjects, each had grievances, requests, and hopes that they carried, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, until the moment came when they could unroll their parchment and ask the king to listen. And listen he did, not because he relished the details of a land boundary dispute between minor lords or the intricacies of toll exemptions for coastal merchants, but because that was the heart of his duty. To listen, to absorb the litany of small problems that, like drops of water, slowly shaped the kingdom's landscape over time. The chamber would fill with the soft cadence of voices, never raised, never hurried, always respectful, for no one dared to disturb the rhythm of courtly speech. A merchant would step forward, clearing his throat gently, and begin his appeal about a new market license, his voice steady, but tinged with the quiet desperation of a man whose livelihood hung on royal approval. A baron's steward would present a meticulously worded complaint, his phrasing as elaborate as the calligraphy on his scroll. Each voice was a note in the king's daily symphony of governance, a symphony that played not in triumphal fanfares, but in the steady hum of administration. The king, seated on a throne that was less a symbol of glory and more a seat of endurance, would listen. He would nod. Occasionally he would speak, but more often than not, his power was expressed in gestures quieter than words. A tilt of the head, a thoughtful pause, a glance towards his chancellor or clerk. The decisions, when they came, were not dramatic. Edicts thundered through the hall. They were simple affirmations. Let it be recorded. Have the chancellor review this, or a subtle nod indicating his consent. For the true labor of kingship lay not in the declaration of new laws, but in the endless process of confirming, revising, and maintaining the vast machinery of a kingdom already in motion. And then came the paperwork. If there was a true symbol of medieval power, it was not the crown, nor the scepter, but the royal seal. A small object of metal and wood, warmed gently over a flickering flame, and pressed into softened wax with the slow, deliberate weight of authority. Scribes and clerks would line up with documents, charters that needed affirming, edicts that required royal assent, licenses, pardons, grants of land, and permissions for trade. Each scroll represented an invisible thread in the complex web that bound the king to his subjects, and the king to his own conscience. The seal, when pressed, made a sound so faint it could barely be heard over the ambient shuffle of robes and parchment. A soft press, a momentary hush, as warm wax yielded beneath the emblem of the realm. The act of sealing was deceptively simple, but behind each press was a decision, a weight, a responsibility. For with that quiet gesture, a village's fate could change. A monastery might gain privileges. A merchant might secure his family's prosperity for generations. The king was not crafting sweeping reforms in these moments. He was maintaining balance, adjusting, ever so slightly, the levers of society to keep order from dissolving into chaos. The work was repetitive, often dull, but it was relentless. Kingdoms were not built in battles alone. They were held together by wax, ink, and patience. As the sun began to rise higher, the rhythm of governance did not quicken. It remained steady, measured. There were no breaks, no retreats to private chambers for idle reflection. Even meals were consumed beneath the shadow of duty. The midday repast was not a leisurely affair. It was a continuation of the morning's work, albeit with roasted fowl and heavy bread on the side. Advisors would use the meal to broach matters that had not yet found their place in the formal petitions. A bishop might lean forward, wine cup in hand, to discuss a matter of diocesan jurisdiction. A favored noble might present a quiet request for royal favor, murmured between bites of cheese and fruit. The king, even in eating, was never at rest. His attention was a resource more valuable than gold, and everyone sought a share. Afternoons brought the council sessions. Here, in a chamber less grand but no less solemn, the king would preside over a gathering of voices, his most trusted lords, his chancellor, his justiciars, his chamberlains. The council was not a place of swift decisions. It was a theater of endurance, where discussions meandered through layers of politeness, where disagreements unfolded in the careful cadence of aristocratic rhetoric. There were no sudden arguments, no heated debates that disturbed the slow pulse of governance. Instead, power played itself out in the nuances of phrasing, the subtle emphasis on a word, the carefully constructed pauses that allowed others to infer rather than confront. The king's role in these councils was, once again, to listen, to navigate the undercurrents of noble alliances and rivalries, to weigh the implications of every suggestion, to maintain a fragile equilibrium that could be disrupted by a single ill-chosen phrase. His presence was both a guiding anchor and a silent referee. The weight of the crown was not in its gold, but in the endless vigilance it demanded as the day stretched on. The halls grew quieter. The petitions had been heard, the councils convened, but there was still the business of justice. The king's court, a mobile embodiment of royal law, was always in session somewhere, whether presided over by justiciars or by the king himself. Justice, in the medieval sense, was a slow and meticulous process. Trials were not spectacles. They were ceremonies of patience. Witnesses gave testimony in formal tones, oaths were sworn with solemn gestures, and each piece of evidence was presented with the gravity of a sacred relic. The king, when present, did not dictate verdicts. He listened, allowed the process to unfold, ensuring that the rituals of law were honored. For in a world where written statutes were sparse, the appearance of fairness was as vital as fairness itself. As evening approached, the royal chapel would offer a brief respite, though even prayer was entangled with duty. The king would kneel, head bowed, as monks chanted the liturgy of the hours. The murmured Latin verses reverberated softly against stone columns. the incense curling lazily towards the vaulted ceiling. Here, kingship was bound to the sacred, for a king's legitimacy was as much divine as it was temporal. But even in this quiet, the burden of rule lingered. The prayers were not merely for the king's soul, but for the stability of the realm. When the final audience of the day concluded, when the last petitioner had been heard, the last scroll sealed, the last murmured counsel given, the king would rise, not with triumph, but with the steady resignation of a man who knew that tomorrow would unfold much the same. The great door, which had opened with such ceremony, in the morning would now close softly behind him. The throne, that emblem of sovereignty, would stand empty beneath the glow of dwindling candlelight. As the echoes of footsteps faded into the long stone corridors, the crown, though rarely touched, during the day remained ever present. It was not the physical weight upon his head that defined kingship, but the invisible weight upon his shoulders, a weight made of expectations, responsibilities, and the quiet understanding that a kingdom's peace was not secured by battles fought in distant fields, but by the ceaseless, repetitive work of governance carried out in silent halls of stone. And thus, the life of a king was not a tale of constant action, but of constant maintenance. Of days that blended seamlessly into one another, each marked by the soft rustle of parchment, the faint press of a seal, the low murmur of petitioners' voices, and the subtle, unending dance of balancing power. It was a life of patience, a life of endurance, a life beneath a crown that never truly left the king's brow. Even when the day's work was done, when we imagine the grandeur of a medieval king's court, it is easy to think of permanence. Stone castles perched upon hills, towering walls of gray and gold, tapestries draped from high rafters, and a great hall where the rhythms of governance unfold beneath vaulted ceilings. Yet this image, like so many others, conceals a truth far quieter and more peculiar. The medieval court, in its most essential form, was not a place. It was a presence. A slow-moving river of people, parchments, and protocols that meandered through the kingdom, reshaping the life of every town and village it touched, however briefly. The king's household was a moving castle of bureaucracy. Its walls were made not of stone, but of canvas, wooden carts, and the endless shuffle of feet upon muddy roads. A king's court could not afford to remain stationary. To rule was. To move, stone castles, no matter how imposing, could not hold the pulse of a living kingdom. Supplies would dwindle, provisions would spoil, the surrounding lands would strain under the weight of royal demands. So, the court would rise like a great groaning beast awakening from slumber, and begin its slow migration across the realm. This was not a cavalcade of knights in gleaming armor, galloping in haste. No, this was a measured, deliberate procession. An entire world packed into wagons, traveling at the pace of oxen, moving only as swiftly as a bureaucracy that accompanied it could bear the dawn of a moving day, was a quiet symphony of soft activity. Long before the sun had fully crested the horizon, the royal tents would begin to stir. Canvas flaps, heavy with morning dew, would be drawn aside with the faintest whisper of wet fabric. Servants, wrapped in woolen cloaks against the chill, would move like shadows, their footfalls muted upon the damp earth. The scent of smoldering embers clung to the air as fires were rekindled to heat water for washing, though the king himself would often remain indoors until the final moments. It was a slow awakening, not marked by urgency, but by the steady, methodical rhythm of practiced hands and routines learned. Through years of quiet repetition, the royal clerks were among the first to labor in earnest. Their world was measured in scrolls and satchels, in wax seals and ledgers too precious to be left to the care of casual porters. Each document represented a living artery of governance, and their safekeeping was a task of utmost solemnity. You could hear them murmuring to each other in the soft light of dawn, ticking off lists of charters and writs, binding them carefully in oilcloths to shield them from the threat of rain. For while knights guarded the king's person, these scribes guarded his will, a quiet army of parchment bearers ensuring that wherever the king went, his laws, his rights, and his records followed. Outside, the steward would be orchestrating the movement of the household with a calm, patient authority. His was a task of endless coordination, for the royal household was not a single body, but an intricate web of offices. The kitchen, the wardrobe, the chapel, the stables, the treasury, each with its own needs, its own routines. Carts laden with barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, and amphorae of wine were checked and double-checked. The wardrobe master oversaw the careful packing of garments, not for comfort, but for ceremony for even the most humble of manor halls. The king's attire must whisper of dignity. Every cloak, every mantle, every gilded belt was folded with a reverence reserved for holy relics, for they were as much instruments of power as the royal seal itself. And then there were the cooks, the bakers, the butlers, whose work was perhaps the most immediate, yet the most unseen. While the king's council deliberated on taxes and treaties, these quiet hands ensured that the household continued to function, that the bread remained fresh, the fires kept burning, the goblets stayed full. Their world was a rhythm of kneading dough and stirring pots, of fetching water from distant wells, of ensuring that by the time the king's traveling court set foot in a new town, his table would be set, his chambers warmed, and the illusion of permanence would remain unbroken. When the procession finally stirred into motion, it did not do so with fanfare. There were no trumpets heralding the departure, no crowds waving banners. It began with the soft clatter of hooves upon cobblestones, the creak of wooden wheels as they protested under the weight of trunks and chests. The king, mounted on a sturdy gestrier or riding within a covered litter, moved at the heart of this quiet exodus. Around him, his household knights formed a respectful perimeter, not in gleaming parade, but in functional silence, their spurs jingling softly with each measured step. Behind them, the entire apparatus of governance followed, a river of humanity stretching far along the winding road, flowing slowly towards its next station of rule. The towns and villages that lay along the king's path would feel the ripples of his coming long before his retinue appeared on the horizon. Word would spread from reeve to reeve, from manor to market square, until even the humblest of peasants knew that the king's household was approaching. Preparations would begin, days, even weeks in advance. Local lords would scramble to ready their halls, their best tapestries unfurled, their silver polished to a gleam. Bakers would rise before dawn to fill their ovens with bread destined for royal platters. Brewers would tap into their best casks, praying they had enough to satisfy the thirst of an entire court. For a royal visit was not merely an event. It was a seismic shift in the local rhythm of life, an intrusion of bureaucracy into the quiet cadence of village existence. Yet, for all the bustle it caused, the king's presence was often fleeting. The household would descend upon a town like a tide, overwhelming, encompassing, yet never permanent. The king might hold court in the local lord's hall, or in humbler regions, in a temporary pavilion erected upon a green. There would be petitions heard, charters sealed, minor disputes arbitrated. A visiting bishop might receive audience. A loyal vassal might kneel for a ceremonial reaffirmation of fealty. And then, as quickly as it had come, the household would begin to fold itself away, like a traveling theater that had performed its necessary role and was now moving on to the next stage. The quiet machinery of governance was never still. Even as the carts were loaded and the tents collapsed, clerks were writing, stewards were accounting, and the great wheel of royal duty continued its slow revolution. The court's movement was not just a matter of logistics, it was a performance of presence. In an age when news traveled no faster than a horse's pace, the physical presence of the king was a statement of authority that no parchment could replicate. His arrival brought the law, and his departure left behind a subtle reshaping of the local order. Small adjustments, sealed in wax that would ripple outward for months to come. And so the journey continued. Over hills and through forests, along muddy tracks that carved their way between hedgerows. The king's household crept forward. The rhythm of hooves on earth, the ceaseless creak of leather harnesses, the low murmur of conversation among servants. These were the sounds that filled the long hours between stops. There was no grandeur in this motion. It was, at its core, a test of endurance. Kingship was not a throne upon which a man could rest. It was a path he was condemned to walk, step by deliberate step, accompanied by an entourage of squires, and 100 other unseen laborers who ensured the illusion of royal omnipresence never cracked dot nights on the road or their own small rituals. As dusk began to settle and the last cart found its resting place, the household would unfurl itself once more. Fires would be lit, the sharp tang of wood smoke mingling with the earthier scents of packed animals and damp wool. Tents were raised in practiced silence, their guy ropes taut and true beneath the steady hands of veteran porters. The king's own quarters, though finer than the rest, were still simple in their essence, a heavy canvas tent lined with embroidered hangings, a sturdy table for his papers, a modest bed that offered little reprieve from the rigors of the road. Within that modest sanctuary the work continued. Scrolls were unrolled upon the table, and the king, by candlelight, would review yet more petitions, his seal pressed with the same deliberate patience, as if he were within the stone walls of his royal castle. The murmurs of his clerks, the soft scratching of quills upon parchment, these were the night songs of reverence. Even in the stillness of a field, beneath a canopy of stars, the crown's burden never eased. Beyond the tent walls, the camp settled into its evening rhythms, the soft clink of armor being unbuckled, the low laughter of servants sharing bread, the quiet prayers of a chaplain beneath a makeshift altar. Life under the crown was not a life of luxury. It was a life of constant, grinding motion, not in haste but in necessity. The kingdom could not be ruled from a single hall. It had to be felt touched, witnessed, reassured by the slow, ceremonial progress of a king who brought his court with him like a moving heartbeat wherever he went. Thus, the king's household was a paradox, vast and yet ephemeral, powerful yet transient. It left no permanent structures behind, but its influence lingered long after the last cartwheel had vanished beyond the horizon. In every village, green that hosted a royal tent, in every manor where the king's steward dined, in every parish where the king's seal confirmed a new charter, the subtle machinery of governance left its quiet imprint. And so, the moving castle of bureaucracy continued its endless journey. Not a castle of stone, but of paper and wax, of breath and footfall, of routines repeated day after day, year after year. For kingship was not a destination. It was the perpetual state of becoming, of arriving, deciding, and departing over and over, until the realm itself grew to believe that the king was everywhere, even when he was not inside the stone walls of the king's hall. Beneath timber-bird ceilings that seemed to loom like the ribs of some vast, slumbering beast, the council chamber would stir to life not with a roar, but with a slow, deliberate murmur. Contrary to the grand visions of kingship where commands were barked and destinies reshaped in moments of fiery rhetoric, the true heart of medieval power was quieter. Here, in the long, slow breath of council, where nobles shifted restlessly in their carved wooden chairs and scribes bent dutifully over their quills, governance unfolded not in declarations, but in the endless act of listening. The king's council was not a theater of command. It was a theater of patience. To rule effectively, a king did not simply speak. He absorbed. He absorbed the grievances of squabbling lords, the cautious advice of wary bishops, the strategic ambitions of military commanders, and the meticulous reports of clerks who lived in a world of tallies and ledgers. It was an exhausting symphony of voices, often dissonant, never ceasing, each vying for a fragment of the king's attention. And so, seated upon his throne, which was far less a seat of comfort than a symbol of endurance, the king would preside not as a tyrant dictating the flow of conversation, but as a patient anchor amidst a tide of ceaseless opinions. The chamber itself, though grand in stone and timber, was not a place of dramatic spectacle. Its grandeur was subdued, softened by the hum of routine. High, narrow windows allowed only slivers of light to fall across the long oak table, turning the dust motes into slow golden dancers in the air. Tapestries lined the walls, depictions of hunts, saints, and ancestral victories, yet even these faded into the background as the business of the day pressed forward. The true decor of the council was movement, the quiet scraping of chair legs as a lord shifted to make a point, the careful clearing of a throat before a baron spoke his piece, the delicate rustle of robes as bishops exchanged wary glances. Across the table's length, council sessions began not with proclamations, but with an air of hesitant expectancy. The king, often seated at the head of the long table, would signal the start of proceedings with the barest nod, a gesture so slight it could almost be missed, yet potent enough to bring the entire room to attention. And then the murmuring would begin. One by one, lords would rise to present their matters. Disputes over land boundaries blurred by generations of inheritance, complaints about taxes deemed too heavy, requests for royal intervention in matters of local justice, where tempers had flared into feuds. Each voice carried its own weight, but none carried authority greater than the king's silence. For it was in the king's silence that judgments were formed, not in the words he spoke, but in the moments he chose to withhold them. It was an art of listening, to hear not just the words spoken, but the undercurrents beneath them. A king had to weigh the trembling eagerness of a young lord, desperate for favor against the calculated calm of an elder statesman who had weathered 5 reigns before. He had to decipher the meanings tucked between lines of flattery and veiled threats, to read the subtle shifts of posture, the fleeting glances exchanged across the council table, the nervous tapping of fingers against polished wood. Power, in this chamber, was not a sword swung swiftly. It was a candle burning slowly, consuming itself in the steady, exhausting glow of attentiveness. And yet, amidst the quiet dignity of these proceedings, there was tedium. Great, yawning stretches of it. The council could deliberate for hours upon a matter as seemingly trivial as the ownership of a narrow strip of pasture land between 2 neighboring baronies. Arguments would circle, looping back upon themselves like vines growing towards an unreachable sun as lords bickered over historical rights, ancient charters, and the half-remembered promises of dead kings. The king would listen, nodding occasionally, his face a careful mask of impartiality, even as his mind catalogued the layers of political nuance wrapped around a dispute that, to an outsider, might seem barely worth a glance, but every detail mattered. The council was not merely a forum for decisions. It was a map of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties. A king who listened well could foresee storms before they darkened the horizon. A careless word, a dismissive glance, could unravel years of fragile diplomacy. Thus, kingship demanded patience that few envied, the patience to sit through endless hours of procedural formalities, to endure the droning of minor lords recounting grievances in painful detail, and to recognize, amidst this sea of monotony, the faint ripples that foretold greater upheavals. Throughout these sessions, the scribes worked without pause. Their quills scratched steadily, documenting every petition, every rebuttal, every subtle agreement. The soft hiss of ink against vellum became the council's quiet heartbeat, a constant reminder that the words exchanged in this chamber would soon take form as royal decrees, sealed and dispatched to corners of the realm where they would shape the lives of peasants, merchants, and knights alike. The king's word, once given, became the law of the land, but it was in these tedious, deliberate councils that those words were born. From time to time, the king would break his silence. But these interventions were measured, deliberate. A question posed here, sharp enough to expose the weakness of an argument. A suggestion there, so softly spoken that it seemed more like a passing thought than a royal directive. And yet, even the subtlest utterance could pivot the entire council's mood. It was not in grand speeches that the king wielded his power. but in the quiet art of steering a conversation without seeming to grasp its reins, as the hours stretched onward. The chamber would grow warm, the air heavy with the mingled scents of burning tallow, aged wood, and the faintest tang of iron from the swords worn by the household knights standing silently at the room's edges. The nobles, arrayed in their layered garments of wool, velvet, and fur, would shift uncomfortably in their seats, their postures a delicate balance between maintaining dignity and relieving the dull ache of rigid formality. But the king remained still. His stillness was not merely a matter of decorum, it was a performance of endurance, a subtle assertion that, amidst all the voices clamoring for attention, he alone had the fortitude to listen, absorb, and decide in quieter moments. When debates lulled into stretches of procedural silence, the council chamber seemed to exhale. A scribe would pause to sharpen his quill, the faint scrape of knife effectuating the stillness. A bishop might murmur a private prayer beneath his breath, his fingers idly tracing the edge of his signet ring. The king's steward, ever attentive, would step forward with a goblet of watered wine, presented with a bow so discreet that it barely registered as an interruption. Even these pauses, these seemingly inconsequential gestures, were part of the council's rhythm, a cadence of patience, of business conducted not in haste, but in the careful unfolding of time. The king's council was not a place of quick resolutions. Matters presented in the morning might not find conclusion until dusk, and many would be deferred, carried forward to future sessions, like stones slowly being shifted along the banks of an ever-changing river. This was the pace of medieval governance, not swift and decisive, but slow, cumulative, deliberate. Each decision layered upon the last, each session a quiet brick laid in the invisible architecture of royal authority. And yet, despite the tedium, the repetition, and the often petty nature of the disputes, there was a profound necessity to these gatherings. The council was the hinge upon which the kingdom turned. It was here, in this chamber of weary lords and scribes, that the fragile equilibrium of the realm was maintained. Through the endless act of listening, the king wove together a tapestry of compromise, ensuring that no voice, however minor, was left unheard, and no grievance, however small, was left to fester into rebellion when the day's session finally drew to a close. It did so not with a declaration of triumph, but with a quiet, almost anticlimactic adjournment. The king would rise, his movement signaling the end of proceedings more effectively than any bell or trumpet. Chairs scraped gently as nobles followed suit, bowing with murmured farewells, their minds already shifting towards the subtle intrigues of the next session. The scribes would gather their parchments, their ink-stained fingers carefully rolling up the records that would soon be transcribed into the annals of royal governance. In this world of paper and wax, time took on a different cadence. The chancery was insulated from the urgency of the battlefield or the spectacle of the royal court. Here, governance unfolded in a measured, deliberate rhythm. The slow, careful drafting of a charter, the deliberate heating of wax, the precise press of the seal. These were the rituals that tethered the realm to order. And amidst it all, the king's presence was constant, not as a figure of pomp, but as a craftsman of state engaged in the quiet, repetitive labor that held his kingdom together. The seal itself was a symbol of continuity. While kings might come and go, the seal, its symbols rooted in tradition, its design reflecting the lineage of rulers past, remained a steady emblem of royal authority. It connected the present king to his predecessors, each impression in wax, a quiet echo of those who had governed before. Each seal a promise that, beneath the surface of change and turmoil, the mechanisms of governance persisted, unchanged in their deliberate pace. And so, within the chancery's walls, beneath the flickering light of iron sconces, the crown's true labor was performed not with fanfare, but with a steady, unglamorous diligence. The king's seal moved from document to document, leaving behind not just a mark of authority, but a testament to the ceaseless, quiet work of kingship. a work that rarely found its way into the songs of bards, but without which the kingdom would unravel into chaos dot as the day waned. And the last scroll of the evening was sealed, the chancery would begin to still. The scribes would stretch, their shoulders heavy with the day's labor, their eyes blurred from hours of careful transcription. The scent of cooling wax would mingle with the dusk air drifting through narrow windows. And the king, rising from his place amidst the day's paperwork, would leave behind a desk not of emptied parchment, but of freshly sealed decrees, their wax glistening like small crimson suns beneath the soft glow of candlelight dot. When we think of medieval kings, it is easy to picture them as distant figures of grandeur, seated upon gilded thrones, issuing commands with the mere flick of a hand. Yet, beneath this veneer of power, a king's influence pulsed quietly through a far less romantic current, the relentless, methodical flow. In a world without banks as we know them, without printed currency or automated ledgers, royal wealth was not an abstract concept. It was physical, tangible, and persistently counted coin by coin, ledger by ledger. Gold, silver, and copper coins passed from hand to hand, their soft clink echoing through the corridors of royal governance. This was the quiet machinery of taxes and tithes, the true engine of medieval kingship. The collection of royal revenues was an act of unceasing patience. A king could not simply summon riches by decree. Instead, wealth trickled upwards through the kingdom's layered hierarchy, from the furrowed fields of peasant farmers, through the tallying fingers of manorial lords, into the coffers of sheriffs, reeves, and tax collectors, until finally those hard-earned coins found their way to the royal treasury. It was a system of endless transaction, an intricate web of duties, dues, and obligations that ensured the crown's survival, not through conquest or plunder, but through the ceaseless rhythm of economic life. Within this structure, every penny was accounted for with an almost meditative slowness. The king's scribes, hunched over long wooden desks in rooms dimly lit by narrow windows, would tally vast lists of taxes owed, scutage, feudal dues, tolls, and royal aids. Their quills moved across parchment with a measured steadiness, each line marking not merely numbers, but the lifeblood of the realm. These scribes did not deal in abstractions. They recorded in precise, unflinching detail the number of sheep rendered in tax from a Yorkshire manor, the barrels of ale from a Sussex brewer, the small silver pennies extracted from a humble village mill for the peasants and townsfolk. Taxes were not distant political abstractions, but a routine presence, shaping the rhythm of life with quiet insistence. The king's tax was felt in the sheaves of grain set aside at harvest, in the extra pots of honey carefully measured for levies, in the few coins anxiously hidden away until the collector's arrival. There was no drama in these transactions, only the slow, persistent drain of obligations that ebbed and flowed with the seasons. And in this way, the king's presence permeated every cottage and croft, not with soldiers, but with a subtle economic touch that shaped daily life. The journey of a single tax penny was a long one. It began in the fields, amidst the soft rustle of wheat and the low murmur of oxen. It passed through the hands of villains, their palms rough and calloused from plowing, into the ledgers of manorial reeves who tallied the estate's obligations with careful precision. From there, it moved upwards to a local sheriff who compiled the dues of entire shires into a single comprehensive account, a dense, sprawling manuscript that would eventually find its way to the exchequer. To the modern mind, it may sound like a term of grandeur, but in truth, it was a place of quiet arithmetic. A large hall filled with long wooden tables arranged in a checkerboard pattern of black and white cloth, upon which bags of coins were meticulously counted, sorted, and recorded. Here, the royal auditor's men of quiet diligence worked tirelessly, moving piles of silver and gold like monks arranging sacred texts. The exchequer was not a place of noise or fanfare, but of soft murmurs and the rhythmic clink of metal upon wood. Every shilling, every mark was weighed, measured, and entered into ledgers with unflinching accuracy. The king, of course, did not stand amidst the counters himself, yet his presence was felt in every calculation. The exchequer was an extension of his will, a quiet workshop where the abstract notion of royal authority became a tangible, countable reality. Through taxes, the king maintained his household, funded his courts, paid for the upkeep of castles, and, when necessary, gathered the resources for military campaigns. But even in times of peace, the flow of revenue never ceased. Governance was not a seasonal affair. It was a year-round enterprise, a constant balancing act of income and expenditure. Beyond the familiar taxes and dues, there were subtler forms of royal wealth. Feudal obligations, for instance, brought income not just in coins, but in goods and services. A vassal might be obliged to provide a set number of knights for a given period, or to host the king's retinue during a royal progress. These duties, though recorded in legal terms, were deeply physical realities. Sacks of flour delivered to royal kitchens, barrels of wine supplied for feasts, woolen cloth provided for the making of royal garments. Every aspect of life, from the meals served in the king's hall to the horses stabled in his mews, was in some way a reflection of this intricate economy. The church, too, played its part in the delicate balance of royal wealth, while tithes were, by custom, directed toward ecclesiastical coffers. The intertwining of church and crown meant that kings often wielded subtle influence over the distribution of religious revenues. A monastery might be encouraged to lend resources for a royal project, or an abbey persuaded to remit certain dues in exchange for royal patronage. These negotiations were seldom loud or confrontational. Rather, they unfolded in the quiet. Exchanges of letters, the soft-spoken conferences between bishops and royal clerks, the slow bar of favors and obligations that kept the machinery of both church and crown humming in unison. Yet, even with such elaborate systems in place, the flow of royal revenue was never assured. Poor harvests, rebellions, or the simple stubbornness of local lords could disrupt the delicate balance. The king, therefore, became not only a collector of taxes, but a manager of crises. His council chambers often echoed with the soft murmurs of fiscal debate as chancellors and treasurers laid out the kingdom's economic health in cautious, measured tones. The realm's stability was not merely a matter of law or arms. It was a product of economic maintenance, of ensuring that the slow, patient river of taxes continued to flow, even when the winds of misfortune blew. For the king, these fiscal matters were as pressing as any diplomatic intrigue or military campaign. The wealth of the crown was not an indulgence. It was a necessity, the silent fuel that powered the machinery of governance. Without it, royal justice could not be dispensed. Castles could not be maintained, and the fragile order of the kingdom would begin to fray at its edges. Thus, amidst the grand ceremonies and public displays, the king's mind often returned to the quiet corridors of his treasury, to the ledgers filled with numbers, to the unglamorous, relentless task of balancing income against need. The royal clerks, who devoted their lives to this arithmetic, were unsung artisans of stability. Their world was one of columns and margins, of abbreviations and ciphered marks that transformed the realm's chaos into a manageable order. They moved through their tasks with a quiet reverence, their fingers tracing the inked lines of accounts that reached back through years, even decades. These ledgers were not mere records. They were the living memory of the realm's economy, a patient, cumulative testament to the slow work of kingship. Among these financial rituals, few were as symbolically potent as the annual accounting at the exchequer. Here, the sheriffs of various counties would appear, laden with sacks of coin and accompanied by scribes bearing thick rolls of parchment. The process was neither swift nor flamboyant. It was a ceremonial reckoning where each sheriff, in turn, presented the accounts of his shire, submitting to the patient interrogation of the exchequer's barons. Every coin was weighed, every discrepancy examined with a calm, methodical gaze. The sheriffs, for all their local power, stood humbled before the impartial arithmetic of royal governance. for the king. These gatherings were moments of reassurance. Each counted penny reaffirmed the reach of his authority. Each balanced account a quiet victory in the endless task of governance. It was not the ringing of swords or the cheers of crowds that sustained his reign, but the soft, steady murmur of numbers aligning, of revenues flowing as they should, of the kingdom's economy holding firm. Beneath his hand, even the physical spaces where this work took place echoed with a certain solemnity. The treasury, often a secure chamber deep within. The castle's heart was a place of silence and shadows. Chests of coin, bound with iron bands, sat beneath layers of dust, their contents guarded not only by armed men, but by the weight of bureaucracy. Access to these stores was strictly controlled, their opening accompanied by layers of formal procedures, witnessed by clerks and sealed by the royal chancellor. Wealth, in this context, was not a spectacle of opulence, but a guarded resource, carefully measured and meticulously tracked and so, through taxes and tithes, through careful ledgers and patient audits, the king's influence extended into every corner of his realm. It was a form of governance that unfolded not in dramatic bursts, but in a slow, unyielding rhythm. The wealth of the crown was not a river that surged. It was a tide that ebbed and flowed with a dependable constancy. Its movements dictated by seasons, harvests, and the intricate machinery of feudal obligations thought in the broader narrative of medieval society. It is tempting to focus on the moments of upheaval, the battles, the rebellions, the grand coronations. Yet, beneath these events, the true foundation of royal power was built upon the ceaseless, quiet work of revenue collection. Kings ruled not merely through force or ceremony, but through the patient accumulation and management of wealth, through the soft shuffle of parchment in chancery halls, through the measured clink of coins in exchequer chambers as evening settled over the castle, and the day's ledgers were finally closed. The king might walk the quiet halls of his treasury, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone. The chests of coin would sit in their alcoves, silent but steadfast, each one a testament to the realm's stability. And in that moment, amidst the hushed reverence of fiscal order, the king would find a deeper understanding of his power, not as a conqueror, not as a judge, but as a patient steward of the kingdom's quiet wealth. The power of a medieval king was not built upon his crown alone, nor sustained solely by his armies, his wealth, or the carved words of law. Rather, it was woven through an intricate web of personal bonds, a quiet tapestry of loyalty and obligation, stitched when vowat, a time. This was the feudal system, the slow and deliberate machinery that tethered lords and knights to their king, not through distant authority, but through the simple human act of pledging one's hands and words in loyalty. In a time when written, law was fragile and armies too costly for constant use. The king's greatest strength lay in these subtle, ceremonial moments, the quiet clasp of hands, the whispered promise of fealty, the soft exchange of breath as oaths were sworn and solemn. Repetitive rites, a ceremony of fealty was not a grand event for spectacle, though it bore all the trappings of ritual. It was a gathering of select few, in a chamber that echoed not with trumpets, but with the measured cadence of formal phrases passed down through generations. The king, seated upon a plain throne of oak or stone, not gilded, not bejeweled weighted. In calm expectation as a vassal approached, often a baron or a knight whose lands, however distant, were tied to the king's vast and visible web of loyalty, the vassal would kneel, not with flourish or dramatic descent, but with a practiced grace. As one who had performed this act many times before, as had his father and his father before him, the air was still, heavy with the weight of continuity. This was not a moment of personal triumph or ambition. It was the steady, predictable heartbeat of governance. Hands were extended, the vassals placed within the king's palms up, fingers relaxed, as if offering not just service, but his very self into the keeping of the crown. There would be no hurried words here. The oath of fealty was spoken slowly, with reverence, like a well-worn prayer. "I become your man," the vassal would say, his voice soft yet certain. "To you, I swear my loyalty, my service, and my counsel against all others." Each syllable hung in the air, as if being absorbed by the ancient stones of the hall, adding yet another layer to the centuries of promises that had been made beneath its vaulted ceilings. The king's response, too, was measured, a simple acknowledgment that carried immense weight. "And I accept you as my man, and I shall protect you, so long as you are true." This mutual exchange was not merely symbolic. It was a binding contract of personal allegiance where the obligations were deeply understood, though seldom written in precise terms. The vassal pledged military service, counsel at the king's court, and the delivery of revenues, while the king, in return, offered protection, the legitimacy of royal favor, and the promise that the vassal's lands would be respected and upheld. It was a relationship of mutual maintenance, not grand gestures. Its strength lay in its repetition, in the sheer number of such oaths quietly exchanged across the realm, forming a network of loyalty that held the kingdom together. Like the hidden roots of an ancient tree, these ceremonies of fealty could occur in many settings, before a royal court in a great hall, within the quiet intimacy of a private solar, or even in a grassy field as the king made his slow, deliberate progress through his lands. The location mattered little. It was the act itself, the slow choreography of hands and words that wove a new thread into the crown's web. The king, as sovereign, did not demand these oaths and bursts of authority. Rather, he gathered them patiently, like a scribe gathering pages of a ledger, knowing that the strength of his realm was not in any single bond, but in the cumulative, ceaseless network of pledges layered over time. For the vassals, these ceremonies were acts of necessity as much as loyalty. To be outside the king's web was to stand alone, a dangerous prospect in a world where power was always shifting, always vulnerable to challenge. By placing their hands in the king's, lords anchored themselves within the realm's recognized hierarchy, securing not only their lands, but their very identity as members of the noble class. Their loyalty was not demanded, it was cultivated, nurtured through a long process of favor, protection, and mutual benefit. The king's memory was long, but his patience was longer. He understood that loyalty was not a static quality. Vassals wavered, alliances shifted. Yet the web of fealty was resilient because it was constantly renewed. Oaths were re-sworn upon inheritance, reconfirmed upon marriage, reasserted after disputes. Each time, the same words, the same clasp of hands. It was a quiet rhythm, a governance of rituals rather than decrees. Within this web, subtle politics thrived. The order in which vassals were summoned to kneel, the placement of their seats at court, even the timing of their summons, all were quiet signals from the king. A delayed call to renew fealty could hint at disfavor. An early summons could suggest rising trust. There was no need for confrontation, no necessity for loud declarations. The machinery of kingship operated best in these silences, where the rustle of a cloak or the soft shuffle of feet across the stone floor carried more meaning than shouted words. Some of the most delicate feudal ceremonies involved the great magnates of the realm, the high lords whose power could rival, or even exceed, that of the king within their own domains. With these men, the act of fealty was a carefully negotiated performance. The king's hand might be extended, but never grasped forcefully. The vassal's kneeling was an act of willing submission, but also a reminder of his indispensable role in the realm's fabric. These oaths, though humble in appearance, were charged with quiet tension. Yet it was precisely this delicate balance that maintained the kingdom's cohesion. The king did not need to dominate his vassals through force. He needed only to maintain the constant, subtle reaffirmation of their place beneath the crown. In some cases, vassals would perform homage liege, a deeper form of loyalty that placed the king above all other lords to whom the vassal might owe service. This was a particularly delicate ritual, often involving multiple oaths and careful wording. To delineate the layers of obligation, here the legal language became a soft, intricate dance, ensuring that the vassal's fealty was primarily to the king, without entirely severing lesser ties to other lords. It was governance as poetry, a linguistic balancing act performed in hushed tones and deliberate phrases. The ceremony did not end with the oath. Often, a symbolic token would be exchanged: a small dagger, a piece of cloth, a slender circlet of gold simple objects imbued with the weight of promise. These were not grand gifts, but quiet emblems of a bond renewed. Subtle affirmations that carried far more meaning than their material value suggested. The hall would remain hushed, courtiers silent as witnesses, as yet another link in the web of fealty was quietly fastened. Feudal loyalty, for all its ceremony, was an evolving relationship. A king did not collect oaths and set them aside. He tended them. His household clerks kept meticulous records, not simply of which lord owed what service, but of when oaths were last sworn, of inheritances, of marriages that might shift the delicate balance of loyalties. The king's council chambers, therefore, often echoed with discussions not of conquests, but of kinships, of marriages that might draw a border lord closer into the crown's embrace, or of rivalries that needed quiet, careful mediation. There were, of course, moments when feudal loyalty faltered. Rebellions, disputes, and the perennial friction between crown and nobility would sometimes erupt into open conflict. Yet even then, the king's first recourse was not always the sword. More often, he would seek to mend the web through quiet negotiations, through the patient reweaving of oaths and obligations. Feudalism was a system designed not for stability in the grand sense, but for flexibility, a living structure that adapted, reformed, and absorbed tensions through ritual and relationship. In this web, even the smallest gestures mattered. A king's personal presence at a vassal's child's christening, the quiet bestowal of a favor at court, the simple act of hearing a baron's petition in private. All these acts reinforced loyalty more deeply than the occasional display. Power, kingship in this light was less an assertion of supremacy and more a constant act of nurturing, a gardener tending to a vast and intricate hedge, trimming, binding, and encouraging its growth in ways that ensured it remained strong, even as its branches stretched far and wide. And so, within the heart of the medieval kingdom, the soft murmur oaths never ceased. In castles great and small, in manors, in open fields, the rituals of fealty continued in their steady, predictable rhythm. They did not command attention. They were not the stuff of chroniclers' headlines or minstrel songs. Yet they were the quiet glue that bound the realm together. For beneath the crown, power was not merely held. It was shared, exchanged, reaffirmed, one soft-spoken promise at a time. As the day faded and the torchlight flickered against the cold stone walls, the king would sit in the soft quiet of his chambers, knowing that his authority did not rest upon the weight of his crown alone. It rested in the clasped hands of his vassals, in the whispered words of loyalty that echoed long after ceremonies ended, in the patient, methodical web of human bonds that needed no banners to proclaim their strength. In the medieval world, no crown sat alone. Above the king, and yet beside him, loomed the ever-present shadow of the church, a dominion not of swords and castles, but of souls, rituals, and the quiet certainties of faith. The relationship between the king and the church was not a rivalry, declared in open conflict, but a slow, careful dance of influence, where power shifted with the rise and fall of whispered prayers, and where every decree from the throne passed beneath the silent, scrutinizing gaze of abbots, bishops, and the ever-watchful eyes of Rome. This was not a struggle for dominance that could be measured in victories or defeats. It was a ceaseless balancing act, performed in chancery halls, chapter houses, and cathedral cloisters, where kingship was softened, sanctified, and sometimes constrained by the weightless authority of heaven. To rule a medieval kingdom was to understand intimately that sovereignty did not begin with the crown, but with consecration. A king was, in the eyes of his people, chosen by God, and yet that divine favor required constant affirmation. It was through the hands of bishops that kings were anointed, through the liturgies of the church that their rule was sanctified, and through the ceaseless prayers of monks that their realm's spiritual health was maintained. The church did not raise armies. It raised altars. Yet, in those altars lay a power that could sway the hearts of lords and peasants alike. A power that kings, no matter how ambitious, could never afford to ignore. Royal councils, often envisioned as gatherings of noblemen and warriors, were just as frequently graced by the quiet presence of mitred bishops. Their influence conveyed not through loud demands, but through subtle, measured counsel. These ecclesiastical figures, seated in their high-backed chairs, would listen in patient silence as lords bickered and barons argued, waiting for the moment when a softly spoken recommendation could tip the scales of policy. Their voices were calm, deliberate, yet beneath their modest tone lay the quiet assurance of spiritual authority, a reminder that laws passed without the church's consent could falter, that a king's legitimacy, however adorned in gold, could tarnish without. The church's blessing, monasteries too, were more than places of retreat and prayer. They were centers of learning, of record keeping, of quiet political influence. A king, poring over petitions and charters in his council chamber, was often reliant upon the scribes trained within monastic scriptoria, their delicate quills tracing not only holy text, but also the documents of governance. These monks, with their bowed heads and silent labor, were the unseen architects of a kingdom's bureaucracy. Through their careful copying of laws, their preservation of royal edicts, they gave permanence to the king's words, yet their allegiance always was first to the church. The rituals of the crown and the church were deeply intertwined, their ceremonies overlapping in a tapestry of incense, candlelight, and solemn procession. A king's coronation, for all its political significance, was foremost a sacred rite. The anointing with holy oil, administered by the archbishop's steady hand, was a moment of profound transformation, not merely the crowning of a ruler, but the consecration of a shepherd, a protector ordained to govern both body and soul. In that hallowed space, beneath the echoing arches of a cathedral, a king was reminded that his power was not absolute. It flowed through the channels of divine grace, mediated by the church's careful rituals. This intertwining of crown and church extended far beyond the coronation. The rhythms of medieval governance were inextricably linked to the ecclesiastical calendar. Royal audiences, court sessions, and even tax collections were often timed to coincide with major feast days, their scheduling dictated by the ebb and flow of the liturgical year. The king's retinue, traveling from town to town, would find their movements choreographed by the feast of a local saint, or the great holy days that marked the Christian year's turning. The slow tolling of cathedral bells was not merely a call to prayer. It was a summons that shaped the kingdom's administrative pulse. And yet, for all this shared purpose, the relationship between the crown and the church was fraught with quiet tension. Kings sought to command the temporal world, while the church guarded the spiritual realm. Yet these spheres in practice overlapped at every corner. Disputes over land, the lifeblood of medieval power, were often disputes between king and bishop, abbot, and baron. A monastery might claim ancient rights over a village stream, rights the king's agents, in their careful assessments, might question. The ensuing negotiations would not be settled by force, but through slow, deliberate councils where both sides presented charters and relics, witnesses, and whispered appeals to ancient custom. The appointment of bishops, too, was a field of constant, delicate maneuvering. Kings, desiring loyal men in ecclesiastical offices, would often press for their preferred candidates. Yet the church, vigilant in guarding its spiritual autonomy, resisted such royal interference. The investiture of a bishop, the ceremony wherein a new prelate received the symbols of his office, became a focal point of royal churchly tension. Who had the right to bestow the ring and the staff? Was the bishop a servant of the crown, or a vassal of the pope? These were questions rarely settled with clarity. Instead, they hovered over each investiture like a soft, persistent murmur, resolved not by decrees, but by patient negotiation, by gestures of deference, balanced with quiet assertions of royal prerogative. Yet kings were astute in navigating these delicate waters. They understood that outright confrontation with the church seldom yielded lasting victories. Instead, they worked through favors, through the granting of lands to monasteries, through the patient cultivation of alliances with powerful abbots. A king might endow a new priory, not merely out of piety, but as a quiet signal of goodwill, an investment in spiritual capital that could be drawn upon when disputes arose. Conversely, a subtle withholding of favor, a delayed confirmation of a bishop's rights, a quiet exclusion from the royal council, could serve as a gentle reminder of the crown's temporal influence, even within the king's own household. The church's presence was inescapable. Chaplains and confessors moved through the royal halls, their roles not limited to spiritual guidance. These clerics were often entrusted with delicate diplomatic missions, their soft voices and humble robes serving as the king's emissaries in matters too sensitive for knights or courtiers. Their counsel, offered in the quiet of private chapels, could steer royal decisions as surely as the loudest nobles demand. Kings, though surrounded by warriors and advisors, often found their most enduring counsel within the quiet confidence of a trusted priest. The church, for its part, was equally dependent on the crown. While its authority was vast, it relied upon royal protection to safeguard its lands, to enforce its judgments, and to uphold its privileges against the encroachments of local lords. A bishop's court might issue a spiritual censure, but it was often the king's sheriffs who ensured that the church's decisions carried real-world consequences. This mutual dependency forged a bond of practical necessity, a recognition, on both sides, that their spheres of influence, while distinct in theory, were deeply entangled in practice. Perhaps nowhere was this interdependence more visible than in the great synods and councils where church and crown convened to deliberate upon matters of shared concern. These were not grand spectacles of decision-making, but slow, methodical gatherings where clerics and royal officers alike would sit through days of petitions, debates, and quiet negotiations. The air would be thick with the scent of wax and vellum. The only sounds the soft shuffling of feet, the measured reading of charters, the low murmur of Latin phrases. These councils did not seek to resolve all tensions. Rather, they sought to manage them, to find that fragile equilibrium where crown and church could continue their shared dominion without overstepping the boundaries of the other in moments of crisis. This delicate balance was tested when papal envoys arrived bearing decrees from Rome. Kings were faced with the subtle task of affirming their loyalty to the church while safeguarding their sovereignty. The refusal to implement a papal edict could lead to excommunication, a spiritual weapon that, though bloodless, carried profound consequences. A king cut off from the sacraments, barred from the church's blessings, found his authority weakened in the eyes of his people. Yet, compliance without negotiation risked ceding vital ground. Thus, kings became masters of the quiet art of delay, of polite correspondence, of pledges to consider, to consult, to deliberate, all the while maneuvering to preserve the crowns. Independence. And so, the relationship between the church and the crown was a ceaseless dialogue, conducted not in proclamations, but in rituals, in letters, in the subtle choreography of deference and assertion. It was a governance of soft tones and deliberate silences, where both king and cleric recognized the necessity of the other. The church lent the king his aura of sanctity. The king, in return, safeguarded the church's earthly dominion. As evening fell upon the great stone palaces and the cloistered abbeys alike, the quiet rhythm of this partnership continued. A king might withdraw into his chapel for private prayer, the flicker of a solitary candle illuminating his face, while elsewhere a bishop penned letters affirming the realm's spiritual well-being. Their worlds, though distinct, overlapped in every corner of the kingdom. They shared the same parchment, the same scribes, the same slow, patient machinery of medieval life dot in the grand imagination of history. The medieval king is often pictured as a dispenser of swift justice, a ruler who, with a wave of his hand, settles disputes and rights wrongs in a moment of decisive authority. Yet, beneath the crown, justice unfolded not in the flash of royal command, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of courts, oaths, and the endless flow of parchment. It was not a spectacle of thrones and decrees, but a labor of patient, grinding attention to law, custom, and the intricate web of human quarrels that stretched from the highest baron to the humblest peasant. To govern was to adjudicate, and to adjudicate was to wait, to listen, to deliberate. Justice under the king was not a river in flood, but a quiet, persistent stream, wearing away disputes with its slow, methodical current. The king's court, in truth, was not a singular place. It was a traveling institution, a moving tribunal that brought the crown's authority into the towns, villages, and manorial halls of the realm. The journey of justice began long before the king himself ever heard a case. Royal justices, learned men of law, appointed by the crown, would travel the kingdom on circuits known as ears. These justices carried the king's peace with them, their presence a symbol of order that transcended local lordships. They were not robed in the dramatic finery of theatrical judges. Instead, their power resided in the weight of the scrolls. They carried, in the careful recording of pleas and verdicts that would weave their way back to the chancery, the arrival of these royal justices in a shire. Town was not a moment of excitement, but one of measured preparation. For days, the town's officials, reeves, bailiffs, and clerks would ensure that the necessary arrangements were made. Wooden benches were dragged into the guild hall or a large chamber of the local castle. Scribes sharpened their quills and unrolled fresh sheets of vellum. Heralds announced the schedule of hearings. The scent of wax and ink permeated the air, and a low murmur of anticipation spread among the populace, not of spectacle, but of duty. For those summoned, whether to bring a complaint, answer an accusation, or witness a neighbor's plea, it was a day of solemn patience. Justice was not swift. It was thorough. Petitioners would wait in the cold, stone-floored halls, their cases folded into rolls of parchment clutched tightly in their hands. Some disputes were simple, a boundary disagreement. Between neighboring farmers, a complaint of unpaid debts. Others were weighty, accusations of theft, disputes over inheritance, or even charges of murder. Yet all, regardless of their gravity, were subject to the same slow process. Each case would be called in turn, the litigants stepping forward beneath. The watchful gaze of the justices and their clerks, their voices softened by the cavernous acoustics of medieval halls. The proceedings were meticulous. Witnesses were called, their testimonies recited in deliberate cadence, often beginning with long preambles tracing the lineage of the dispute. Documents, if they existed, were presented with solemn ceremony, unrolled with care, the seal of authenticity, inspected under the dim light filtering through narrow windows. For those who could not read, which was the vast majority, the physicality of documents, the texture of parchment, the impression of wax seals carried a tangible weight of authority. Here, law was not an abstraction. It was a sensory experience, felt in the rustle of scrolls, the cold press of the justice's seal, the firm, deliberate recitation of oaths. Oaths were the cornerstone of medieval justice. In an age where written evidence was rare and forensic inquiry unheard of, the human voice, bound by sacred vow, was the primary instrument of truth. To swear an oath was not a casual act. It was a ritual often performed with a hand placed upon a holy relic or the pages of a gospel. Perjury was not merely a legal offense. It was a spiritual peril, an act that imperiled the soul as much as the body. Witnesses approached the bench with hushed reverence, their words measured, their eyes lowered. The very atmosphere of the Court was shaped by the gravity of these spoken truths, each oath adding a layer to the careful construction of justice. For the king, justice was less about personal judgment and more about the maintenance of a system. The sheer volume of cases made direct involvement impossible. Instead, the king's role was to ensure that his laws were applied consistently, that his justices acted with integrity, and that the machinery of governance continued to turn slowly, but surely beneath the weight of its own procedures. Yet, in moments of great dispute, when the matter was of significant import or political delicacy, a case might ascend to the king's personal audience. These were rare occasions, but when they occurred, they were marked by an even greater solemnity. The king's personal court of justice, often referred to as the Curia Regis, was not a grand, bustling arena. It was a chamber where silence held sway, where the scraping of chairs and the quiet cough of a clerk punctuated the long intervals of deliberation. Here, the king listened, not as a monarch dispensing arbitrary commands, but as a guardian of the realm's order, interpreting the law with the counsel of his legal advisors and the subtle interventions of his bishops. The process was exhaustive. Each argument was weighed, each custom considered. Kingship in these moments was an exercise in patience, a testament to the quiet endurance of a ruler who must sit through hours of procedural minutiae before rendering a decision that would ripple through the kingdom's legal fabric. Yet justice, under the crown, was not confined to these formal proceedings. The king's influence permeated even the smallest village through the concept of the king's peace. To break the king's peace, to commit an act of violence, theft, or disruption was not merely a crime against an individual, but a crime against the realm itself. The maintenance of this peace was delegated to sheriffs, constables, and local reeves, whose duties, though often mundane, formed the bedrock of royal authority. These officials were the unsung functionaries of medieval governance. There lives a quiet litany of inspections, summons, and reports, their authority exercised through a balance of local familiarity and royal mandate. The collection of fines and the imposition of amercements were central to this system. Justice was, in many ways, an economic enterprise. The fines imposed for breaches of the peace, for failed court appearances, or for minor transgressions, fed the royal coffers, sustaining the administrative apparatus of the kingdom. Yet these financial penalties were not arbitrary. They followed a carefully maintained schedule, a graduated scale that reflected both the severity of the offense and the social status of the offender. The fine for a noble's trespass was not the same as that for a villain's. The law acknowledged hierarchy even in its punishments. The scribes recorded these sums with meticulous precision, each fine a small but vital thread in the fabric of governance. Over time, the codification of royal justice evolved. What had once been a patchwork of local customs and oral traditions began to crystallize into written law codes, painstakingly compiled by royal clerks and jurists. These compilations, such as the Assize of Clarendon or the Statute of Westminster, were not lightning bolts of legislative innovation, but slow, accumulative endeavors. They grew from the careful observation of judicial practice, from the gradual harmonization of disparate customs into a coherent body of royal law. Each statute, before it became a command, passed through layers of consultation, drafting, and revision, a process that mirrored the very methodical pace of medieval justice itself. One must not imagine that medieval justice was blind to its own limitations. Kings and their justices were acutely aware of the imperfections of their system, of the ways in which influence, wealth, and social standing could tip the scales. Yet, rather than sweeping reforms, the Crown's approach was one of incremental adjustment, the appointment of more justices, the refinement of legal procedures, the tightening of oversight on local officials. The king's justice was not a pursuit of utopian fairness. It was a daily labor of maintenance, a recognition that order was achieved not through perfection, but through persistence. In the quiet rhythm of this legal machinery, one finds the true essence of medieval kingship. The crown was not a symbol of arbitrary might, but a fulcrum around which the slow pivot of law revolved. The image of a king as a lawgiver, seated upon a throne of judgment, is far less accurate than that of a king as a supervisor of scribes. A listener of petitions, a moderator of disputes that unfolded in the subdued murmurs of courtrooms far from the battlefield. His justice was not thunderous. It was deliberate, even tedious, yet in its tedium lay its strength. For those who lived under the crown, this slow justice provided a kind of stability. It may not have been swift, nor always impartial, but it was predictable. The processes were known, the rituals familiar. A peasant might wait months for his case to be heard. But in that waiting, there was a certain assurance that when the moment came, his voice would be heard, his complaint recorded, his grievance subjected to the same solemn procedures as that of a Lord Dot as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the court scribes carefully rolled up the last of the day's parchment. The echoes of that day's justice would linger in the quiet halls. There was no triumph, no fanfare, only the slow, unending task of keeping the peace, of settling disputes, of holding, however tenuously, the fragile threads of order. A medieval king was, by nature, a figure of motion, though the crown itself was a symbol of rooted authority. Gleaming as if anchored to the throne, the man beneath it seldom remained in one place. To rule was to move, a ceaseless rhythm of departure and arrival, of crossing rivers and winding through forests, of leaving behind the cold stone walls of one castle only to step beneath the vaulted ceilings of another. The kingdom was not ruled from a distant, fixed capital, but from a moving court. A peripatetic government whose presence was felt most keenly in the slow, ceremonial waves of royal progress. To follow the king was to step into a world where governance was carried not in the pages of decrees, but in the weight of footfalls upon the earth, in the quiet arrangements of towns that prepared for the fleeting visit of a monarch, the royal. Progress, known in Latin as iter regis, was not a grand parade of spectacle, but rather a logistical necessity woven into the fabric of medieval governance. Roads, as we might envision them today, were often little more than muddy tracks flanked by hedgerows or dense thickets of woodland. Bridges were scarce, and river crossings could be treacherous, their safety dependent on seasonal modes. Yet, through this difficult terrain, the king's household would press onward. A caravan of attendants, scribes, knights, stewards, chaplains, and the endless retinue of servants and pack animals carrying the cumbersome machinery of medieval administration dotted. Was a moving court of murmurs and preparations. Before the king ever approached a town or manor, his stewards would send messengers ahead, their task not to announce a ruler seeking homage, but a household seeking accommodation. The impending arrival of the king meant that provisions had to be gathered, a task that rippled through every level of local society. Bakers would rise before dawn to knead dough for twice their usual demand. Brewers would be instructed to double their casks, ensuring that the king's men would not thirst. Butchers, poulterers, fishmongers, all would feel the weight of royal appetite, not as a festive demand, but as a logistical trial. The town's officials, from the reeve to the lowliest clerk, would oversee the allocation of lodging. The king's personal quarters were not luxurious in the modern sense. They were often makeshift chambers prepared within the local lord's hall or in a monastery's guest wing. The royal household, however, was sprawling, and every vacant room, barn, or alehouse might find itself requisitioned for some element of the king's train. The arrival of the crown reshaped the geography of a town, if only for a handful of days. For the king himself, the journey was not a leisurely sojourn, but a structured continuation of his ceaseless duties. His days on the road began early, often before the mists had lifted from the fields. The slow rhythm of hooves striking earth became a backdrop to whispered consultations with his stewards, the exchange of sealed missives with his clerks. The king's mobile chancery, a collection of carts laden with scrolls, Wax, ink, and portable desks allowed the administration of the realm to continue uninterrupted. Even as the landscape shifted from forested glade to open moorland, governance did not pause for the difficulties of travel. Instead, it adapted, growing accustomed to the gentle sway of parchment-laden wagons and the subtle adjustments required when court convened. Beneath canvas tents rather than in stone halls, the century world of royal progress was not the resplendent pageant often romanticized in later chronicles. It was a world of trudging boots and jingling harnesses, of leather straps creaking beneath burdens, of the sharp scent of horses intermingling with the earthy aroma of churned mud. Yet within this constant grinding motion was an intricate dance of organization. The king's marshals would direct the formation of the retinue, ensuring that carts did not bottleneck narrow pathways, that pack animals did not stray into boggy ditches, that the royal banner, a subtle yet potent signal of sovereignty, remained visible at the column's head. When the king's cavalcade finally neared a town, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. From the distant fields, villagers would spot the dust cloud rising, a faint plume that signaled the approach of authority. Bells might be rung, not in exultation, but as a practical measure to alert the populace of the crown's imminent presence. Children peered from cottage doorways. Merchants carefully rearranged their stalls. Local clergy prepared to offer blessings. Yet there was no fanfare, no triumphal archway. The king's arrival was more often marked by the soft tread of hooves, passing through cobbled streets, by the murmured exchanges between stewards and town reeves, confirming that lodgings were in order. Once within the town's precincts, the royal household became a subtle, humming hive of activity. Scribes would unroll their scrolls upon makeshift desks, their quills scratching out letters of grant, summons, and ordinances. The royal cooks would set about the monumental task of feeding the court, their cauldrons simmering with stews that combined local produce with the preserved provisions of the journey. Knights and household officials would convene in quiet clusters, discussing matters of land disputes, oaths of fealty, and the unending minutiae of local governance that required the king's oversight. These visits were not ceremonial detours. They were working engagements, the physical embodiment of the king's obligation to be seen, to listen, to adjudicate for the local populace. The king's visit was a double-edged affair. It was a moment of validation, a brief intermingling with the highest authority in the realm. Yet it also bore the strain of obligation. The financial burden of hosting the royal household was not insignificant, and while compensation existed in theory, the practicalities often fell upon the shoulders of townsfolk and local lords. Nonetheless, the ritual of royal progress reinforced a sense of connection between crown and subject. The king's presence, however fleeting, was a visible reaffirmation of governance, a tangible reminder that the distant figure spoken of in charters and tax rolls was indeed a living monarch, passing through the same muddy streets, pausing to hear the petitions of his people. Amidst this endless motion, the ceremonial aspects of kingship were quietly upheld. Masses were celebrated in the local church, attended by the king and his chaplains with a subdued solemnity. The royal almoner distributed alms to the poor, a ritual both charitable and strategic, for acts of mercy were woven into the fabric of royal legitimacy. These ceremonies were not grand spectacles designed for chronicler's embellishment. They were simple, predictable rites that anchored the crown's authority in the everyday rhythms of medieval life. The journey would resume. As it always did, after a handful of days, the retinue would stir before dawn once more, loading carts, saddling horses, gathering the disassembled pieces of a mobile government back into its traveling formation. The town, for its part, would return to its quieter routines, the impressions of hoofprints slowly fading beneath the shuffle of daily commerce. Yet, in the king's passing, a subtle recalibration had occurred. Disputes had been settled, oaths renewed, charters sealed. The king's progress was not measured in miles, but in the steady reinforcement of order. Royal progresses followed no single pattern. Some were strategic, ensuring the king's presence in volatile regions. Others were practical, dictated by the need to inspect royal estates or oversee judicial inquiries. Occasionally, they carried diplomatic undertones, allowing the king to receive foreign envoys or to engage in subtle displays of influence within the territories of powerful vassals. Yet, regardless of their impetus, all progresses shared a common thread. They embodied the crown's slow, methodical assertion of presence across a sprawling realm got in the larger towns and cities. The king's visit might occasion more elaborate ceremonies. Civic leaders would present keys to the city gates, a symbolic gesture of loyalty. Guilds might arrange processions, banners fluttering in the breeze, accompanied by musicians whose melodies were more practical than grandiose, designed to accompany rather than overwhelm. But even in these moments of heightened pageantry, the underlying tone was one of sober diligence. The king was not an aloof spectator. He was an active participant in the unending labor of governance. As seasons shifted, so too did the nature of royal progress. Winter journeys were fraught with difficulties, icy roads, swollen rivers, and a bitter chill that seeped through even the heaviest cloaks. Summer, while less perilous, brought its own challenges. Dusty paths, sweltering days beneath heavy armor, and the ever-present concerns of ensuring clean water and safe lodgings amidst the itinerant throng. Yet, regardless of weather or terrain, the crown remained in motion. The kingdom's stability depended upon it. For the king himself, these endless travels were a testament to the burdens of office. While the throne room conjured images of command and authority, it was upon these winding roads amidst the creak of wagons and the soft clip of hooves that kingship truly unfolded. It was a reign enacted through patience, a rule that demanded presence, not in the grand halls of distant capitals, but in the muddy courtyards of manor houses, in the echoing chambers of village churches, in the quiet, transient campsites. Along river banks as the sun set upon another day's journey, the royal retinue would settle into a familiar routine. Tents were erected with practiced efficiency. Fires crackled as cooks prepared the evening meal. Scribes, by the glow of lanterns, continued their unending work of recording, drafting, and sealing. The king, perhaps seated upon a simple wooden chair beneath a canopy of fading light, would review the day's petitions, his hand guiding the slow flow of governance as deliberately as the path of his journey. The road was the king's second court, a place of continuous labor, quiet, authority, and subtle influence. Royal progress was not a pageant of triumph, but a practice of presence, a testament to the crown's obligation to govern not from afar, but through the tangible, if transient, act of being seen and heard long before a crown ever touched a king's brow. The ceremony of kingship began. In the medieval world, power did not emerge from the mere assumption of a throne. It was carefully layered, step by step, through rituals that soothed the anxieties of a kingdom yearning for order. A coronation was not a moment of spontaneous celebration, but a slow, deliberate unfolding of gestures, prayers, and ancient customs that wove a man into the fabric of monarchy. To be a king was to become a symbol, and that transformation occurred not through conquest or decree, but through ritual performance, each movement rehearsed, each word weighted, until authority was not simply declared, but made visible in the quiet gravity of sacred rites. On the day of a coronation, the world seemed to breathe more slowly. At dawn, as mist still clung to the arches of cathedral cloisters, the king-to-be would rise not in triumph, but in solemn preparation. His attendants, moving like shadows across cold stone floors, would lay out his ceremonial garments. These were no mere clothes, but woven texts of their own, a vestment of meanings. The soft gleam of cloth of gold, the deep crimson of velvet mantles, the delicate embroidery of lily, lions, or crosses. Every thread spoke of lineage, of divine favor, of the weight of expectation. The king's body became a vessel for these. Messages, clothed slowly, reverently, layer upon layer, until he no longer stood as a man alone, but as a figure prepared to absorb the hopes and fears of an entire realm. The very act of dressing was a ritual in itself, a quiet prelude where the rustle of silk and the clasp of brooch marked a metamorphosis, not into royalty as a privilege, but into kingship as an exhausting duty. Outside the cathedral, townsfolk would begin to gather, though not in the frenzied anticipation of a festival. They came with a subdued patience, knowing that the day ahead would not be a spectacle of immediacy, but a long, meandering procession of rites. The coronation was a public affair, but it was not designed for entertainment. It was crafted to soothe, to assure a people that even amidst change, the rituals of order remained unbroken. The first steps into the cathedral were heavy with silence. The great doors, carved with scenes of saints and kings long past, would groan open to reveal a sanctuary already alive with soft candlelight. The air inside was thick with incense and sweet, smoky tendrils curling lazily towards the vaulted ceilings, where sunlight filtered through stained glass in delicate mosaics of color. Every footfall echoed, every rustle of robe became a part of the cathedral's own breathing as the king approached the altar, but he did not yet wear a crown. That would come later, after layers of prayer and symbolism had prepared both king and realm for the act of enthronement. The coronation began with an anointing, an ancient sacred rite that whispered of a king's dual nature, both temporal ruler and chosen servant of God. The oil, warmed gently to soothe the skin, would be touched to his brow, his chest, his hands, each gesture an invocation, not of supremacy, but of service. The murmured Latin prayers of the archbishop seemed to suspend time itself, drawing both clergy and courtiers into a moment where the weight of kingship pressed not upon the head, but upon the soul. As the anointing concluded, the king was dressed once more, this time in regalia reserved solely for the rite of coronation. The coronation robe, often woven in heavy, shimmering gold threads, draped across his shoulders like a mantle of both honor and burden. The sword of state, presented with quiet formality, was not an instrument of war in this moment, but a symbol of justice, a blade to protect the peace, to sever falsehood, to uphold the laws whose slow, grinding wheels turned, not in battlefields, but in council chambers and chancelleries. And then the crown. It was never hurried. The moment of crowning was a study in stillness. The archbishop, with hands steady from years of repetition, would lift the circlet of gold, adorned with gemstones, each glinting softly in the candlelit haze, and lower it with exquisite slowness onto the king's head. There was no shout, no sudden trumpet blast. The hush deepened, as if the very air had been drawn inward. The crown settled upon his brow not as a prize, but as a weight. The people, standing beyond the cathedral doors, would not see this moment directly. They would sense it in the subtle shift of the bells, in the distant chant of the choir, in the very atmosphere that seemed to exhale as the crown found its place. From that point forward, the king was no longer merely himself. He was kingship personified, a figure who bore upon his shoulders the fragile scaffolding of a society bound together by custom and belief. The coronation continued with oaths, their phrasing familiar yet grave, to uphold justice, to protect the church, to defend the realm. These promises, spoken in a voice that echoed against the stone pillars, were not binding through force, but through ritual expectation. The very act of speaking them aloud in that sacred space, before clergy, nobles, and the watching spirits of ancestors, was a contract written in the ink of ceremony. Once the oaths were given, the king was enthroned, seated upon a chair often ancient, scarred with the marks of kings long past, its worn surface a silent testament to the continuity that ceremonies like this sought to preserve. The enthronement was not theatrical. It was measured, almost meditative. The king's posture mattered. His hands resting lightly upon the carved arms of the throne conveyed not domination, but steadiness. His gaze cast not down upon his subjects, but forward was trained to evoke calm resolve. The choir would sing, not exuberant, but slow, resonant chants that filled the cathedral with a sonic embrace. These were hymns of order, of lineage, of the seamless passage from one reign to the next. Every note seemed to reinforce the notion that while kings may change, the structure of kingship remained unbroken, unwavering, deeply familiar. Outside, the waiting crowds would sense the ceremony's progress through subtle cues. The rising of a banner atop the cathedral spire, the altered rhythm of the bells, the movement of royal officials along the edges of the gathering. There were no grand proclamations. Rather, the community absorbed the coronation's significance through the slow osmosis of ritual acts. It was a performance of stability, designed not to dazzle, but to reassure. After the enthronement, the king processed through the cathedral's nave, flanked by bishops and great lords, his steps echoing in the hush that followed the choir's final notes. Each gesture, the slight inclination of his head, the composed folding of his hands, was a part of the unspoken language of kingship. There was a serenity to these movements, as if the crown, though heavy, had brought with it a profound stillness. The people, upon glimpsing their newly crowned monarch, would see not a man elevated, but a figure absorbed into the timeless choreography of rule. Feasts often follow coronations, yet even these were steeped in ritual. The coronation banquet was less about indulgence and more about the measured display of hierarchy. The seating arrangements, the order of toasts, the sequence of served dishes, all followed a strict protocol that mirrored the kingdom's social structure. The soft clinking of goblets, the subdued murmur of conversation, the deliberate pace at which each course was presented, all contributed to an atmosphere of controlled festivity. Even celebration was choreographed, a carefully maintained performance of order amidst change. For the king, the coronation marked not the beginning of power, but the acceptance of a mantle that would weigh upon him for the remainder of his days. The ceremonies were not a victory lap, but an initiation into the endless work of governance. From the moment the crown touched his brow, he entered into a rhythm of duties that would not relent: councils, judgments, progresses, and the infinite flow of documents that required his seal. The rituals of coronation crystallized this reality, reminding both ruler and realm that kingship was less about grand gestures and more about the relentless maintenance of a social architecture that depended on predictability. And yet, amidst the slow, deliberate pace of these ceremonies, there was a quiet beauty. The coronation was a rare instance where the otherwise invisible labor of kingship was rendered visible, albeit in symbolic form. It was a moment where every element, the robes, the oaths, the crown, the throne, coalesced into a tableau of continuity. In a world often unsettled by famine, conflict, or shifting alliances, these rituals provided a steady anchor, a reaffirmation that beneath the surface, the structures of governance endured as the evening fell and the candles in the cathedral were extinguished one by one. The king would retire, not to a night of revelry, but to a quiet chamber where the weight of the day's rituals settled into the quiet burdens of rule. Outside, the people would drift back to their homes, their lives continuing within the same frameworks, subtly reassured that the kingdom's rhythm remained unbroken. The coronation had not altered their daily toil, yet it had reaffirmed the scaffolded in their world thought the next day. The king's work resumed, councils convened, charters reviewed, petitions heard. The crown, though gleaming, did not insulate him from the slow machinery of governance. It served rather as a constant reminder of his role within it, a symbol not of escape from duty, but of complete immersion within it.